Hi, I'm Tony Holtz from Axiom Compliance Learning. We're going to show you a video today on how to inspect a fire hose reel, and we're going to do a level 2 or a yearly inspection on a fire hose reel. But before we start, there's a few important points that you need to remember. First of all, fire hose reels can become a part of a much larger fire system. They can be connected to hydrant systems, they can be connected to fire pump sets, and they can be connected to fire indicating panels. Before you start inspecting a hose reel, understand what the building design is. If the fire hose reel is connected to the general water supply, so it's just like another tap on the system, fine, you can go ahead, there's no special requirements. However, if the fire hose reel is connected to a fire pump set, you're going to need to understand how to isolate that pump set before you start inspecting and testing that fire hose reel. And the same applies to a fire indicating panel. Some indicating panels will automatically call the fire brigade when there's a pressure drop in the fire hose reel system. So if you turn the fire hose reel on for testing purposes, you might have the fire brigade rock up to your doorstep, and that'll be a $1,700 bill for you, because I'm sure the owner won't want to pay that bill. So understand your system before you start inspecting. We're going to cover the checklist and the inspection requirements of an individual hose reel, but during the course we covered it a little bit further about these other attachments to fire hose reel systems. I just want you to understand that there's more to it than just a checklist and inspecting a fire hose reel. Thank you, enjoy the course. Hello, today we're going to inspect and test a hose reel. We're going to use the AS 1851 checklist, and we'll get started by looking at the signage. So we've got to have a sign that's 2 metres off the ground and visible from 20 metres, like most of our inspection items. And secondly, before we get started, we really should be looking at the connection to the mains water system. So in the introduction, we mentioned that there are some issues with hose reels that are connected to fire pump sets or fire alarm panels. So I've looked at that system. This is just a standalone hose reel that is connected to the metered water supply. I have noticed though that the pipe work is the wrong size. The pipe supplying a hose reel in accordance with AS 2441 should be 25mm pipe, and we've got a small pipe, and I'll make a note of that on my checklist. The pipe work is a bit too small. Secondly, we probably should, as we're looking at the pipe work supplying our hose reel, we should be checking that there's no ancillary equipment or other connections to the hose reel system that shouldn't be there. So that also forms part of our end of year survey, and we'll take care of that at the end. And that's an annual report. So we're going to do a yearly inspection, which is a level 2 inspection on our hose reel. And the hose reel has a 6-monthly and a 12-monthly inspection requirement. And the checklist changes in the 12 months. So we first of all go through the 6-monthly requirement and then do our yearly requirement. And I'm just going to go through it as though I was inspecting it as a yearly requirement, following no particular order. It's just the way that you end up getting your little system to do it. And as I said before, first of all, I usually start with the signage, and all this happens as you're walking up to the hose reel and just looking at the system in general as you're approaching the device. So secondly, we need to be looking at the signage and the condition of the reel itself. And so I'm noticing a bit of rust starting to appear around the bolts on the sign, and the sign's a little bit rough. It's starting to get a little bit of rust appearing there. I'm going to make a note of that. I'm not going to fail it. I can still read the sign. It's still quite visible. And generally, if I do get a little bit of surface rust starting on the hose reel, I'll take out my paint or some kind of anti-rust paint or something like that to fix that up for the customer. But I'm going to make a note of that and pass it. My signage is okay. And while the hose is still fully reeled, I'm going to check and make sure that it's sitting on the wall okay. So I'm just going to give it a bit of a move, and if you push it into the upward direction, you'll see whether the bearings are okay. or actually the bushes are okay. Oftentimes they don't have bearings anymore, just bushes. And if you push it to the upward direction and you don't get a lot of movement there, you will always get some movement sideways like this. But in general, that looks like it's fixed to the wall pretty well. And while I'm at it, I'll look at the actual attachment to the wall. I'm noticing here that I don't have any bolts on the lower bracket, but it is still quite firm. I'm not going to fail it because of that. I might make a note on my record that one of the brackets doesn't have bolts, but there is a V bracket in behind the hose reel. And when you look behind, you'll see that this whole attachment is part of the reel itself, and it just sits on top of this V bracket and forms a very stable connection to the wall surface. So all of that looks pretty good. The other thing I need to do is look at my maintenance record tag, make sure it's there, make sure it's in a position that is not going to inhibit the rolling out of the hose. In general, most of the time they go onto the hose guide. That's an okay position. I am noticing that the tag is out of date, well out of date. So I'll make sure that I put another tag on it before I finish my, my service. So while I'm looking at the, this area, I'm looking also at my stop valve and the nozzle interlock. So I'm particularly interested in whether the nozzle is locked into this position so that in order to remove the hose nozzle from the reel itself, I've got to turn it on. So this is called a nozzle interlock, and there's many different types of nozzle interlocks available. This is just one type. And I'm noticing as soon as the water is turned on, I'm starting to get a few drips coming out of the centre of the hose reel. Not too concerned about that at this point. We will be checking for leaks once I've unreeled the hose reel. In particular, if it's outside, I'm less concerned about those small leaks. Most hose reels around the connection point, they sit there for quite a while before the, at least 6 months before this is done again. And so the seals can dry up a little bit, and as soon as they get a little bit of water on them, they may leak a little bit. So, so the other thing, I'm sort of doing a few things at once. I'm getting more and more leaks as this is rolling, but I'm doing a few things at once here. I'm mindful of the hose guide, and the requirement of this hose guide is that in any position, it is at least 75 millimetres away from the drum. So be careful of these hose guides that are mounted above this bracket, because it ends up tangling the hose up into the reel as I'm trying to reel it out. And one of the other requirements is that as I'm reeling the hose reel out, I've just got to make sure that it's reeling off the hose so that I don't have to keep on coming back and fixing it up to try and get it to the place that I want to use it. And that really comes down to how it's been rolled up, and so towards the end when we finish we'll be rolling it up, and it's a bit of an art, and we need to make sure that we roll the hose reel up so that when somebody needs to use it, it can be unreeled without any difficulty. So every 6 months I've got to unroll 5 metres of this hose just so that I can check that it's unwinding okay. So because we're doing a level 2 test, we're going to be rolling out the whole hose. So we need to roll out the hose for a couple of reasons. First of all, to make sure that it is capable of rolling out to its full length without any problems. And secondly, to check the hose and make sure it doesn't have any kinks or damage to the outer surface of the hose as well. So I'm going to go ahead and take my morning 36 metre walk, and you've got to be careful when you're doing this too, because sometimes if you don't have a lot of space, I've got plenty of space here to roll this out, sometimes you can start to kink the hose up, like, you know, if you've unrolled your hose at home off the tap, you know what I'm talking about. So just be mindful as you're rolling the hose out. I sort of take a full long walk and then walk back with it, and that just stops the hose from kinking over itself. So I'll take my walk and I'll be back in a second. Okay, so I'm back after my long walk. So now you'll notice that the hose has been rolled out in a way that it's not going to cause it to kink when I start to roll it back up. So I'm doing myself a favour there and making it a little bit easier when I go to roll the hose back onto the reel. Now I'm just really checking the nozzle and making sure that it's not leaking. And I will be turning it on and off in a second. I just want to point out the connection of the nozzle to the hose. It's fairly common to see a hose clamp or a worm drive type of clamp on these hoses. I'm not a big fan of that, and I'll remove that and reconnect it via a proper crimp, which I'll show you before the end of the video. So the problem with the worm drive clamp is it ends up putting a sharp edge onto the hose, and you can cut yourself and make it more difficult to turn the nozzle on by having that type of connection. So you need the proper crimp connection for the hose. This for the nozzle, it's not leaking, looks quite good. And so I'm just going to check the connection to the hose within the reel now and just make sure that that's not leaking and I don't have any bad connections there. So you might see some drips coming out of this section of the reel here. As I said, it's kind of stopped leaking now, so the seals have taken hold again. I'm just mindful of that, and once I reconnect the hose reel back to its normal state, I'm just going to be looking at whether that leak persists or not. The other thing to point out is, I don't know whether we can see it or not, you'll notice some flat spots forming on a hose, and there's evidence of it here, where when the hose sits on top of the reel on its first couple of turns, the weight of the hose starts to compress it. And I'll speak about this when we roll the hose back up again, but so you can see some damage to the hose here and here. So each time it makes connection to the drum, if there's weight on it, it's going to start to compress the hose. And I'll talk about that when we roll the hose back up. And I like to leave a little bit of water in the hose for that reason, just to leave a little bit of buoyancy in the hose itself. This is one of the reasons that it's really important to roll the hose all the way out every 12 months. We need to be checking these points here and making sure that that flat spot isn't causing any restrictions to the hose itself. Okay, so at this point, we want to check and make sure that there is water available to us. So each 6 months, we roll the hose meter out 5 metres, as I said, but we still need to turn the hose on. Now, in an outdoor area, it's okay to turn the hose on. I'll use, you'll see my device for doing this inside as we do our yearly flow test. But I just want to turn this nozzle on and make sure that I have water coming out. Now, there's quite a bit of water coming out, and I'm expecting around about 6 or 7 metres of a squirt there. And this particular nozzle has 2 different positions. One is a spray position and one is a jet position, or that position there. So I'll talk more about this later, but you can use this to your advantage as you're doing your yearly flow test, because we actually get more water out of the hose in that position there, in the spray position, than we do in the jet position. Okay, so we'll turn it off. Got plenty of water coming out of our hose, which is good. Okay, so on our level 2 inspection, or every year, we need to prove that we have sufficient water in accordance with the standard. Now, this is a 19 mil hose, so we measure the hose from the inside diameter of the pipe, and the 25 mil hose you don't see very often. When we need a longer hose reel, sometimes they'll make them a 25 millimetre hose, and it's a fairly big hose. You'll notice the difference when you see a 25 mil hose. So this is a 19 mil hose, and the flow rate required in accordance with the standard is 0.33 litres per second. So it's fairly simple. We just take a container, and I use a container that has a 10 litre mark on it, and I'm going to turn the hose on, fill the bucket up, count how long it takes to fill the bucket up, and then do a calculation to come up with a flow rate in litres per second. So I'll just grab my container and we'll do a flow rate. Okay, so Vital Source have generously donated their bottle for me, which is quite good because the nozzle or the inlet allows me to put just about any size hose nozzle in there, and it stops me from getting wet, so all the water remains in the container. It's also really good, these types of containers, for doing this flow test inside. So I've marked my container at 10 litres. I'm going to put it down on a fairly flat surface, which is not really flat, but flat enough. And I've turned my stop valve into the off position, and I've turned my nozzle into the on position. Okay, so I'm going to try and turn this on at the same time as I turn my hose on, which is going to be a bit of a juggling act, but I'll get it done. So I'll control the flow with the stop valve. There we go. I'd like to leave the nozzle in the water without creating too much resistance, just so that I get a nice swirl happening and not too much air, and then I can see when this reaches its mark, which is about now. So that's 28.07 seconds, or roughly 28 seconds, to fill 10 litres of water. So now I'm going to calculate my flow rate. So I'm going to use my phone, and I need to divide the 28 seconds into the 10 litres. So the big number needs to be divided into the small number is my easy way of remembering it. So if I say 10 divided by 28 gives me 0.35 litres per second. That's fairly close to the mark, isn't it? It's supposed to fail at under 0.33 litres a second, and we're only 0.2 of a litre per second above our fail mark. So it's getting pretty close. Now, I'm going to turn the hose back on just to give you an idea of what the flow is coming out of the nozzle at that flow rate. So that's on our spray nozzle, and if I move it back to where I think I'm going to get a better flow rate, I'm going to try that flow test again and see if we can improve our result. That's one of the reasons I like to control the nozzle or the flow rate from here, so that I can set my nozzle to a reasonable position. I don't want this test to fail because it can be very expensive for my customer to have to put pumps in and increase this flow rate. So we'll do it again with a nozzle position that I think is going to improve it, and we'll see how we go. So I've emptied the container. Now to give it another crack, I'll just set my timer again and start the test. So I stopped my timer when it reached the 10 litre mark, and now we have a test result of 22 seconds, which is an improvement. So we need 10 litres divided by 22 seconds, and that equals a flow rate of 0.45 litres per second. So we have a significant improvement with the nozzle position changed. And so we're not fudging the results here, we're just giving the hose reel the best opportunity to pass the flow test rate. So that's, if you get a low flow rate to start with, try and improve your nozzle position. Or sometimes if you don't have the option to put the hose reel into the spray nozzle position, sometimes the hose reels are just a jet nozzle, you can change the nozzle and you can improve it that way. I just wanted to point out how to put a new nozzle on. So I've got a nozzle here that's been cut off, and my crimping device and my crimping tool. So I mentioned in the video that I'm not a fan of the worm drive, and this is how I would, what connection I would use to put a new nozzle on. Now there's a number of different types of these crimp lugs that you can use, but essentially it's quite simple. You just sort of remove the nozzle from the hose, put it back on again, or put your new nozzle back on again, take your crimp either side of it, and this already has one on it, and it works quite well. And once you've crimped it, it's as hard as it is. So just to finish off my inspection, I've put my my new tag on. I've added it to the existing tag that's there, and I'm going to stamp a level 2 inspection on in September 2020. And it's done. Okay, so now to finish up, we're going to do my favourite part, which is rolling up the hose. Now I've noticed that my spring, which stops that kinking at that first connection, has moved, so I'm going to make sure that's up in the correct position. I'm going to leave the hose pressurised as I do this. That minimises that risk of creating these flat spots on the hose as I'm rolling it up. And it's a bit of an art, so you've just got to wind it on and make sure that you don't overlap any of the hose as it's going down its little path. Trying to keep it nice and tight as I do it, and that aids the rolling out of the hose and makes it quite easy for the user. Okay, in actual fact that wasn't pressurised, but it is what it is now. So I'm now going to need to pressurise the hose to put it back into the nozzle lock. So the hose is now filling up with water. It's going into its nozzle lock. Whoops, starting to get a bit of a leak there. And I lock it into the nozzle lock position. And now I just want to take that pressure off those seals. Now, because it's outside, I can just unwind this nozzle a little bit of water out, but I don't want to completely depressurise the hose. I just want to take a little bit of pressure off those seals. Now this is all right when it's outside, and my flow test bucket's no good when it's inside because you can't get it up into the nozzle, so you may need another bucket just to stop the water from going onto carpet or into the areas on the inside when you're doing that. And I'm just going to make sure that this leaking stops, and I may come back and check it and make sure that leaking stopped. If the leaking doesn't stop, while it's sitting there, I'm going to recommend that the hose gets replaced. So you can wear a pair of gloves if you don't want to get your hands dirty. So before we conclude, I just want to make one more point. Sometimes if we've got hose reels that are supplying fuel depots or places that've got a high risk of a fuel fire or a B-type fire, they'll put in foam branch pipes, and it's a part of our checklist to make sure that if a foam branch pipe is put into our system, that we check that and just make sure all of the connections onto the foam branch pipe is okay. And just be mindful, if there is a foam branch pipe in the system, that foam will come out along with your discharge test. Okay, so that concludes our video. Thanks for watching.